on tea. This is not the letter T, it is what is sometimes called cha or tea. Those words come from Chinese in different parts of China, and it's a beverage. It's obviously something which is sustained around the world, and I have a particular interest in it, which led me to write a book with my mother, Alan Macfarlane, on Green Gold, the Empire of Tea. And that particular interest arises from the fact that my father was a manager of a tea plantation, or several tea plantations, through his life. That was his occupation, and soon after I was born, I went to live for a year or so of my infancy on a tea plantation, and have been back. So tea is in my blood, as I joke. And when later I came to write that book, I began to see that tea was not just a humble brew which I enjoyed drinking and which revived and refreshed you, but something mysterious and intriguing. And if you looked at its world history, you could see, as in the title, that it was an imperial plant. That is to say, not only did it prop up the British Empire through the East India Company and so on, but it, like imperialism, it spread. So in a kind of inversion, you can say that we thought we were spreading tea and planting tea bushes, but the tea, in fact, was using human beings to propagate itself. It had made itself so attractive through properties I'll explain, that humans thought, right, we'll go not just one, but hundreds of thousands. We'll move it from China to Assam, from Assam to Sri Lanka, Ceylon, to East Africa, everywhere. So tea is now the most widely spread, in many ways, of plants, and it is also by far the most widely consumed beverage or drink in the world, apart from water. In great tea drinking countries like Australia or Ireland and Britain, and even in America, most people on average in Britain and elsewhere drink several cups of tea a day. I've just had my morning tea and I'll be drinking green tea through the day, and each time I drink it I have this mellow, invigorating feeling, and that of course is one of its great attractions. The caffeine in the tea acts in a way differently from coffee caffeine, which gives you an immediate rush of energy, but then you slump down somewhat and you have to have another cup. With tea, it slowly infuses you, and it reaches its maximum point of benefit after about 20 or 30 minutes and continues, and you don't have a downside to it. So in many parts of the world, tea was the thing that really sustained people. If you look at, for example, rice growing in Japan or China, the immense hard work of slaving in the sun on very poor diets, traditionally for peasants, was made possible, and many forms of work were made possible by drinking tea. And that likewise occurred in the British Industrial Revolution. If you read accounts of 19th century factories, you find that the tea trolley coming round every hour or two, bringing this dose of caffeine to people. So you drank tea in the mines and the factories, and one of the backbones of the British and other industrial revolutions was tea drinking. So tea is an amazing stimulant, and I used to tell my students, whether it was fair or right, that if they wanted to do better in their examinations, they should drink some tea half an hour or so before the exams. Make sure they weren't allergic to tea, but if they liked it and tolerated it, drink that, and it would seriously improve their scores. And this has been tested by scientists who've done tests with computers where people have been faced with various kinds of puzzle, placing objects, remembering objects, moving objects, and both the motor skills, the speed at which you can write or type or whatever, is increased quite considerably by tea, but also the memory and the associative power is stimulated. So tea really improves your performance in many ways. It's not a banned substance, and I'm surprised that all sprinters and others don't drink a bit of tea first. Maybe they do. So there's all that side, which is why human beings on the whole spread it, because it made them feel good. But there's also another side which I didn't know about, which is the medicinal side, which is that tea tannin, as it's called, which is the main bulk of tea, is actually scientifically known as phenolics. And phenolics are one of the most powerful antibacterial substances known to human beings. When Lister, the great reformer of hospitals in the middle of the 19th century, wanted to disinfect the hospitals and pull down the death rates, he used phenolics. And the phenolics in the tea, which are perfectly absorbable by human beings, are an important, indeed immensely powerful antibacterial substance. They did tests in the later 19th century using microscopes, and they looked at the effects of tea, cold tea, on major waterborne bacteria like cholera and dysentery and typhoid, and the cold tea killed all the bacteria straight away, whereas water, so it wasn't the boiling of the water in the tea, which also obviously helps a bit, but it was the actual tea had something in it. And this is an effect which I think has absolutely dramatically changed our world. In the book I suggest all sorts of things. For example, that the movement south, the great movement south of the Chinese in the 7th, 8th, 9th centuries to southern China, which was malarial and potentially filled with waterborne diseases, was made possible not merely by the effects of drinking tea on agriculture, but also in keeping people healthy. The fact that Japan had very few waterborne diseases from the introduction of tea in the 13th, 14th century, I think is related to drinking tea. The possibility of having an industrial revolution in Britain, where normally when you have an improvement in technology, bigger cities, then people die off in higher numbers through waterborne diseases. And for the first time in history, in 18th century Britain, in the middle of the century, people didn't die off. Adults and children survived. And this is exactly associated with, and at the same time as, and I think caused by, the importation of cheap tea for the first time from China. So we couldn't have had an industrial revolution without tea. And the British Empire, which was based on tea trades to China and the links with India and the East India Company. Again, the British Empire, I don't think, would have been in the same shape without tea. So tea has made history. It's destroyed countries. The Opium Wars were based around the need of the British to have tea and hence to trade opium to China in order to get the money to pay for the tea they needed. So it's had destructive as well as positive influences. But it really is a miracle plant, more important, I think, than any other plant. I suppose rice is pretty important too, and potatoes have their say, but tea. And so when I'm feeling down or needing a bit of relaxation, and of course that takes you to its effect on aesthetics, the way of tea, the chado in Japan, is bound up very much with porcelain and art styles, and to religion, where tea is absolutely central to certain forms of Buddhism, for example, and even in the West to Methodism and the temperance movement were revolving around tea. So in every sphere of life, this humble plant originating in the eastern Himalayas, coated with something which protects it against all the viruses and bacteria, because it also seems to be effective against certain viruses and maybe against malaria as well. That humble plant has changed our world, and human beings on this planet would be totally different without this tea. And recently in China they sequenced the genome of the tea, found it was twice as long as any other plant, and it had all sorts of interesting similarities with other plants which have been shown to be effective against malaria and so on. So it's a miracle plant, and all I can do is salute my good fortune in being the son of a tea planter, for good or ill.